It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the ViewSonic XG341C-2K. As usual for video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and by YouTube. It also depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so in no way will it accurately represent what you'd see using the monitor firsthand. There's also a detailed written review, which this video really accompanies, and there's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, are nice ways of showing your support. This monitor has a 34-inch VA panel with a mini LED backlight and a 165Hz refresh rate. They advertise 200Hz, but I'll get to that a little bit later on in the review. It has a 1500R, so that's a moderately steep curve as well. And when you look at videos and pictures of the monitor like this, it does look like there's a strange little pincushion effect going on. This is a bit of an optical illusion really. When you're using the monitor in person, the curve is very easy to adapt to. In my opinion, it really suits a screen with this kind of width, and it's something which you really just forget is there after maybe a few days of using the monitor. It just draws you in a little bit, and it can enhance the viewing comfort by giving you a bit of a more uniform viewing distance between the centre and the edges of the screen. The resolution on this one is 3440 by 1440, so it gives you a good amount of desktop real estate. It's like having a 27-inch QHD model with extra space, extra pixels and extra physical space at the sides. So it's good for multitasking. It gives you a decent pixel density as well, and that's also similar to a 27-inch QHD model. So not the same clarity or crispness potential as a 4K monitor that's 32 inches or smaller, but still a decent amount in this respect. If you're just using a single application which requires a lot of horizontal space, or where a lot of horizontal space would be useful, perhaps you'd usually do a lot of horizontal scrolling. Video editing might be a good example of that. Not so much Microsoft Word as I'm showing you right now, but you can see you can get a lot of text on the screen at the same time horizontally. There's also an article on the website looking at the 3440 by 1440 resolution in more detail. I also talk a little bit more about this in the written review in terms of the experience with games and also watching movie content. So most games and a lot of movie content now, it does support the aspect ratio properly, and you'll get a full screen experience with the benefits that come with that. But basically for games, most games use HOR plus, horizontal plus scaling, and that means that when you have a wider aspect ratio like 21:9, you basically get the same kind of view vertically, but horizontally you get extra field of view in your games without any sort of adjustments to the field of view slider, so there's not a kind of fisheye effect like you get if you adjust the field of view slider normally. So it can certainly enhance the immersion. And I will show you some gameplay, but there are some nice pictures in the written review comparing 16:9 to 21:9. So definitely do check that out if you're interested. I'm now going to cover the external features of the monitor. So it has what I describe as quite a stealthy gamery look, so there aren't lots of colourful elements, matte materials used throughout. So that's matte plastic for the bottom bezel there. This stand, it's a real statement, as you can see. It's a large stand. It's also coated metal, so it has a good premium feel to it. Gives a really weighty, solid feel to the overall screen. The neck there is also coated metal. You'll also see it's a rather deep stand, so it does take up quite a bit of depth on the desk. So if you don't have a particularly deep desk and you still want the screen some distance from the eyes, then that could be a little bit of an issue. The top and side bezels are what I call dual stage, so they have a slim panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen. That's very difficult to see when the screen is switched off as it is now, but elsewhere in the review you'll be able to see that panel border. It's always there whether it's on or off, it's just how easy it is to see or not. And then there is a slim hard plastic outer part to the bezel as well. As I mentioned earlier, the screen is curved with a moderately steep curve, 1500R, and the screen surface is what I would classify broadly as light matte anti-glare. So that means it isn't as light as some solutions, certainly glossy solutions, so the QD OLED ultrawides, but also some of the LG Nano IPS ultrawides. They have a slightly lighter screen surface as well, but it is certainly lighter than you would see on models with what I'd classify as a medium matte anti-glare screen surface. The effect that the light matte screen surface has on the image is explored in the contrast section a little bit later. And in terms of its glare handling, you will see that there is some glare, and some of those patches of glare are a bit sharper So kind of mild reflections where there's strong enough light striking the screen surface. So that's light striking from a window. You can actually see sort of an outline of some of the windows or bits of the window. But I would say that the curve exaggerates that or accentuates this as well. So if you're using it from a normal viewing position, depending on the lighting, you might see some sort of stretched patches of glare because of the curve. I tend to find it's fine. I don't have windows directly behind me, so it's fine for my normal viewing position. But artificial light sources could potentially cause this as well. But certainly when you're viewing it a bit off angle, you can see the glare sort of haze across the screen. From the rear, again, you can see just how solid the stand is. Really nice, chunky, coated metal stand. I do like that in terms of the premium feel, although this design is rather chunky, as I mentioned before. But it's mainly matte black plastic. There is glossy black plastic hexagon around the stand attachment point. There are also Elite RGB LEDs, which are explored in the OSD video, and also the OSD control joystick there, which, as you might expect, is explored in the OSD video as well. There are also some little protrusions here. These are just little flip-down mouse anchors if you've got a corded mouse and you want to keep the cable in place, and this one is a little flip-down headphone hook. Towards the bottom right, there is also a K-slot Kensington lock slot. And towards the bottom of the stand neck, there is a cable tidy solution. There's a little bridge there as well if you want to use just the top area, but for larger cables, or if you've got more cables, you can use the bottom bit as well. The screen offers good ergonomic flexibility as well. You can tilt the screen, you can swivel it left and right, and you can adjust the height by quite a bit actually, and the exact adjustments are given in the written review in the features and aesthetics section. For the ports, you have an AC power input, which means this monitor has an internal power converter. You've got two HDMI 2.1 ports, you've got DisplayPort 1.4, you've got USB-C with 90 watts of power delivery, DisplayPort alt mode, and upstream data capability. You've got a USB-B upstream port, and you've got three USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, as well as a 3.5mm headphone jack. The monitor also includes up-firing speakers, that's two 5-watt speakers, and I explore them a little bit in terms of the sound output in the features and aesthetics section of the written review. They're alright, but not amazing. Now in terms of the capabilities of the ports, you can get up to 200Hz if using the overclock, or 165Hz if not, via DisplayPort, and also via HDMI. There's also HDR support via HDMI and DisplayPort. There is VRR support by way of Adaptive-Sync, which means you can use AMD FreeSync Premium Pro and NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. And because it's HDMI 2.1, there's VRR support via HDMI, which means the PS5 can use VRR as well. And the monitor also includes a downsampling mode, so you can run it at 4K UHD, that's 3840 by 2160, at up to 120Hz. So basically you can make the full use of the signal of games consoles like the Xbox Series X and PS5. Check out the written review for more information about the ports and the capabilities. Moving on now to the contrast performance of the monitor. So as usual, I like to start to talk about Black Crush, because this is a VA model and that is an issue with this one. Not a huge amount of Black Crush. If you know what Black Crush is, just going to set your mind at ease a little bit there, but there is still some. So with this PCM Black Crush test, a highly scientific test I devised myself, you'll see that there is a black background and there are the letters PCM written in dark grey. It's the same grey throughout the image, but on the screen it doesn't look like one single shade. It looks like it is more blended, a darker grey in the middle, and further out peripherally, particularly lower down from a normal viewing position, you will see that the grey appears lighter. The reason for that is that there are perceived gamma shifts. So the gamma for these dark shades to your eye, it appears quite a bit higher centrally than it does peripherally, where it appears actually a bit lower than it should. And because this is such a large monitor, particularly a wide monitor, you can certainly get that a bit to the edges. It's a bit difficult to show this in the video, but to the eye, the PCM text actually looks brighter than it should. It's the same at the bottom of the screen as well from a normal viewing position. So when I say normal viewing position, your eyes will be a little bit above the center of the screen. If you have your eyes more centrally or a bit lower down even, then you can notice this more towards the top of the screen. So what this means in practice, there can be a masking of dark detail centrally, or the region which is in line with your eyes, and there can be a bit of extra detail, excess detail peripherally. But as I said, it's not an extreme amount of black crush, and the gamma shifts in general aren't extreme on this model, but they are still there. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about contrast performance using some in-game examples. So to start off, yes, there is that black crush, so a little bit of detail lost centrally, and a bit of excess detail further out, but it's not too bad. And also, I find the excess detail can be a bit more noticeable for heavily compressed streamed content, because that tends to have compression artifacts which should really be masked, but can be brought out more strongly. In this case, where the perceived gamma is lower than it should be peripherally, but again, these aren't extreme shifts, just something to be aware of. But the overall contrast performance is strong on this model. I measured 4200 to 1 for the static contrast ratio using my test settings. It can actually be a little bit high depending on the settings you're using, because I made some colour channel adjustments there. This is certainly strong, and it is significantly stronger than what non-VA LCDs could achieve without using some kind of fancy local dimming. And be aware, I don't have local dimming active at the moment. I will explore that separately very shortly. It's also beyond what some VA LCDs would achieve. So this gives a nice depth, a nice atmosphere to scenes like this. So there's good depth to the dark shades. It doesn't look deep and inky like an OLED would look in a dark room like this, but it just captures more of that than you'd get on many LCDs. There is also VA glow to be aware of. You might be able to see that in the video, mainly towards the bottom of the screen. So it lightens up those dark shades, and it's also a bit towards the top of the screen. It depends on your viewing position. Again, this is a viewing angle dependent thing, but from a normal viewing position, tend to see it as a sort of bloom towards the bottom of the screen. And on this model, it's quite interesting actually. The VA glow tends to have a slightly cool appearance in some places, but a bit of a warm, slightly orange appearance elsewhere. It isn't as strong as IPS glow. It doesn't eat up into the screen as much, but it's just something to be aware of. I know many people are very familiar with IPS glow, but they don't even necessarily think VA glow is a thing or know about it, but it is a thing. There is some here. It can also be brought out more strongly if your unit has issues with clouding or backlight bleed. My unit does actually have a bit of a clouding issue towards the top and bottom of the screen, but not too bad in that respect. And also if you're sitting closer to the screen, it's brought out more strongly, and if you're using a higher brightness on the monitor. For brighter shades, such as this lovely campfire here and the white icon there, it appears reasonably smooth. There's not an extreme amount of graininess. There's a little bit of a what I'd call a light, misty graininess to the screen surface. So it's quite decent in that respect. Certainly good enough that most people wouldn't really notice this, wouldn't have an issue with it. Something I'm quite sensitive to. And because this has a light matte anti-glare screen surface, it doesn't have the same amount of layering you'd see on stronger matte screen surfaces. There's not sort of an obvious layering in front of the image. There is, of course, a little bit of a layering. This isn't a glossy screen surface, and it isn't a very light matte anti-glare screen surface, but it's again at a level which most people won't find bothersome. I've just brightened the room up a bit because I realised that you're not always going to be looking at this monitor in a dark room or a dim room. So it's not super bright, but I do have a bit of natural light in the room now. And you can notice, depending on your lighting, that there will be glare patches on the screen, and that's diffused across the screen surface as this is a matte anti-glare screen surface. And that does give a bit of a sort of hazing to the image, but it also masks the VA glow and the slight weaknesses in contrast. As I said, this isn't sort of an OLED level contrast experience, but I would say that the experience this gives you in a dim room, in a moderately dim room, and in a reasonably bright but not extremely bright room is beyond what you'd get with many LCDs. Back to the boring old desktop now. The camera's been adjusted in a way which will make it look overexposed. That's intentional. So I'm going to talk about local dimming now. So this monitor has a mini LED backlight with 1152 dimming zones, so that's a good number of dimming zones. It isn't as many as the monitor has pixels by a very long way, so the monitor has around 5 million pixels. You've got 1152 dimming zones, certainly not one zone per pixel. So there are some issues to be aware of. It doesn't give you an OLED-like experience again, but it does greatly enhance the contrast, and you'll be able to see that quite clearly when I turn the setting on. So it's found in display under local dimming, and there are 4 different levels you can set it to. I'm just going to start with level 4, and I'll explain the levels shortly. So you should now be able to see that the black is now much deeper. Because of the exposure in the video, this won't be so clear, but the icons are now super bright. I mean, to my eye, there's a clear difference, a very clear difference in how bright these icons are. And also the taskbar. In fact, the taskbar is so bright that the camera isn't even picking up these icons in the middle there. It just looks like one big, massive, giant ball of light. But if I open up Twitter with its dark mode, or its lights out mode as they call it, you'll be able to see those desktop icons. So those local dimming settings then, they change how much the monitor is light biasing or dark biasing. So you can see here there's a mixture of light and dark content. I don't like to use the local dimming setting at all on the desktop, and that's because you have straight edges, you have well-defined edges, you have large patches of bright and dark content, and there are definitely these inconsistencies which I don't like on the desktop. And another thing is that really this limits utility in many cases, regardless of what you're doing. You can't adjust the brightness, you have no control over the brightness, and this gets very bright, the local dimming setting. Exact measurements in the written review if you're interested in that side of things, by the way. But you might think that if you reduce the level, I'll just put it to level 1 to give you an extreme example, that will make things less bright. It doesn't really. The brightest shades are still very bright as long as they're large enough. So this here, for example, it's very bright, so bright that the camera isn't even picking up the text there. And this is with level 1, remember, but it does change the dark biasing versus the light biasing. So with level 1, it's the most extreme dark biasing, and that means that when there are smaller white objects or collections of shade, such as this text here, my mouse cursor with the black in the background, because there isn't per pixel illumination here, there's a compromise that has to be made with the zones where they'll have to decide, are they going to brighten up for the bright content or are they going to dim for the dark content? They can't do both at the same time, not each zone. So if there's small bright content surrounded by darkness, or bright content surrounded by somewhat darker shades even, you do get this situation where it will need to dark bias or bright bias. So if you look at my mouse cursor, you can barely see it when it's over here, surrounded by darkness because it's dark biasing so much. If I up the local dimming setting, you'll see this revealed more and more. So that's level 2. Level 3, you can just about see my mouse cursor again. And level 4. I wouldn't say the differences between these levels are as dramatic as they are on some monitors, but it is really something you'd have to set according to your own preferences. I prefer to use a setting of 3, level 3. It kind of depends on the content. So for me, sometimes I prefer a lower level, sometimes I prefer a higher level. I'd probably set it to level 2.5 if such a setting existed, just in general. And as I mentioned, you don't have one dimming zone for each pixel, and you get mixtures of dark and brighter content. So haloing is something you have to be aware of. This will increase for smaller bright shades if you're using a higher local dimming setting. The lower local dimming settings will decrease this for smaller bright shades, but where you've got big bright shades, you can get it anyway, regardless of the local dimming setting you're using. There's a compromise that's just unavoidable. Very difficult to capture this because of the brightness levels which are being pumped out here, and I've sort of experimented with a few different exposure settings on the camera. It's very difficult to show this accurately, but I can see it to my eye around the mouse cursor. I can see it certainly around the text here, around the image there. So the black there, for example, is just clearly not as deep to my eye as the black over here when the black's on its own. Just something to be aware of. There are other inconsistencies when you use local dimming as well. These are very difficult to show you on the video, I'm afraid, but there are some gamma changes. So for some reason, when I have this window lower down here, the colors look quite funky here. It looks kind of clearly oversaturated. The gamma looks kind of messed up. Whereas if I move the window further up, that doesn't happen. You might be able to see there are some shifts anyway, although even if you can't see the exact nature of the shifts. So it can be a little bit strange, but the gamma with local dimming on, it does depend on the content being displayed. That's not specific to this monitor, that's a very normal thing. I'm now on YouTube dark mode just to show you some more strange inconsistencies when you're using local dimming. And these inconsistencies, they're certainly more noticeable on the desktop, and I don't like using local dimming settings on the desktop at the best of times. With this one having locked brightness as well, definitely don't like to use it. Far too bright for my liking, for regular use. But you'll be able to see these halos more clearly. The camera does capture it quite nicely with this darker or medium grey shade in the background and the light text there. You'll be able to see it. around my mouse cursor as well. You're able to see that little halo. But the local dimming zones do react very rapidly to changes in the scene, so that's good. It doesn't sort of have a laggy feel to it or anything like that. It's a reactive local dimming solution. There's some strange striations here as well, which you don't notice when local dimming's disabled. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on. It also looks like there's a kind of box there, and these sort of shift around a bit when you move the window, and the haloing next to the scroll bar there is quite extreme, so that there's a really bright grey when really it should be the same grey shade as it is in the middle. So anyway, I'm going to shut up about this on the desktop. Like I said, I don't really like to use it on the desktop. It's meant for gaming, it's meant for movies, more dynamic content, so I will show you some of that. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider now. I have local dimming disabled just so you can sort of calibrate your mind, if you like, as to how things look with the setting disabled in this particular scene. The camera settings are a little different to what I was showing you before, so the VA glow might be more noticeable, but when I turn local dimming on, I'm just going to use my preferred level 3 setting for now. Things look very different now. Unlike on the desktop, there aren't sort of big black blocks now. This is not black. It does have what should be some black elements, but it's too much of an intricate mixture for the dimming zones to be able to deal with, because there are actually some medium to bright shade, the skulls there mixed in as well. Very intricate mixture. And the other thing is that unlike under HDR, there isn't the same level of tone mapping precision. And as I mentioned, the brightness is locked, so it's locked at a really high level. If you're interested in the measurements, please do check out the written review. But let's just say it's definitely not shy on brightness with the local dimming setting, even under SDR. So it does tend to lift up some of these medium shades too much, and bright shades are definitely very bright. The campfire there, for example, is very bright indeed. The light around the bow there as well in the middle, very bright. You can also see some haloing around the bright HUD elements there where it has my ammo count with the darker shades surrounding it. But the depth of the dark shades is improved, and there is that reduction in VA glow, and you might consider this scene a little bit of a sort of torture test because it's very mixed. Some scenes will not have this sort of intricate mixture of medium shades and will have more blocks of dark shade, but to be honest, I like to give a sort of representative idea of what you can expect with the setting, and what you can expect is a definite edge in contrast, but you can also expect locked brightness. You can expect some shades to look very bright, others, medium shades, to look brighter than they should, which can give things a bit of a lack of depth. So, to be completely honest, I don't love this setting because of its lack of flexibility. With local dimming settings like this under SDR, I much prefer to be able to set the monitor to a comfortable brightness and know that where there's enough darker content for the dimming zones to do their thing, that it will dim significantly and give me a nice edge and contrast, but still limit the overall brightness. So that would be what I would like to use for regular use when I'm gaming or prolonged use. Otherwise, I'm just going to be using HDR where things are mapped much better, and you tend to get bright highlights, and there's better control of the medium shades so they don't over brighten in the same way. So really, with the way they've set things up, it's sort of just a very much inferior HDR rather than some kind of thing you might want to add to the SDR experience, in my opinion. Some people are still going to like this, using local dimming under SDR for movie content, for game content, and some strange people might even find it okay on the desktop, although I think they'd be in a very small minority. And also, just in case you were wondering, if I lower the local dimming setting all the way to level 1, it does deepen things a little bit, those medium shades. This isn't going to come across properly on the video, but to the eye, there's still a definite lack of depth. The darker shades there should be a lot deeper than they are. It can't account for these intricate variations of shades appropriately. So again, don't really like the setting under SDR. Moving on now to the colour reproduction, and I like to start off with lagom.nl, the website, and their test for viewing angles, because I like to talk about colour consistency. So with this monitor being a VA panel, having a VA panel I should say, there are some gamma shifts to be aware of. So the Lagom text would ideally appear quite consistent, blended grey throughout the screen. In this case it appears more blended centrally, or the region which is in line with your eyes, or the camera in this case, and there are some more colourful elements, sort of a bit of red mainly towards the edges in particular, a little bit towards the bottom as well from a normal viewing position, and this sort of cone which is more blended. So usually the cone is much tighter, and that means that the viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve is stronger, and that's a bad thing. Whereas on this one, it's more of a kind of loose cone, a bit more of a gentle gradient. So the viewing angle dependency isn't as strong to the gamma curve of the monitor, but there is still some level of dependency there. It can become clearer when you look at solid shades. The purple block here, it always looks odd to the camera, so I'm just going to have to describe it. But to my eye, it appears quite a pinkish purple throughout the screen, but there are stronger pink tints towards the edges, the side edges and bottom of the screen. And the pink hue will shift readily as you move your head, or in this case, if I move the camera, you're able to see the sort of blooms of pink, the shifts between the pink and purple. The red block appears a rather vibrant red throughout the screen. It does have more of a faded red or slightly pinkish appearance towards the extreme side edges and the bottom from a normal viewing position. And again, this depends on your viewing position. If you have your head a bit further down, then you might see this a bit towards the top as well. And if you're sitting close to the screen, then these shifts I'm talking about will be exaggerated. If you're sitting further from the screen, as long as you're keeping your head quite central to the screen and not viewing from clearly off to the side or something like that, then these shifts are going to be reduced. The green block appears a fairly consistent and quite vibrant green chartreuse shade throughout the screen. There is more of a yellowing, a bit of a brighter green quality, a bit more yellowing towards the extreme side edges and bottom of the screen. The blue block, as usual, is a rich royal blue throughout the screen. I'm now on Battlefield 2042, so I'll talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. This monitor has a rather generous colour gamut. It extends well beyond sRGB, and that means for normal content, whether you're playing a game, watching a movie, or on the desktop, that's usually designed with sRGB in mind. And if you have a wider colour gamut than that, and you're using the full native gamut of the monitor, then you can expect to see oversaturation and extra vibrancy. So you can see here, I measured 95% of the DCI-P3 colour space. There's a huge amount of extension beyond sRGB, and although it's 95% DCI-P3, so there's a little bit of underextension in some regions, you can see quite a bit of overextension in other regions, particularly when you look at that red region, or just generally the red to blue edge, which also encompasses pinks and purple shades. And for those interested, I measured 90% Adobe RGB, so there isn't as much extension into the green region, or the green to blue edge, which would also encompass cyans, as some models would show, particularly ones with quantum dot backlight solutions like this have, but tuned differently. They would have higher Adobe RGB coverage and thus more extension in the green to blue edge. Anyway, what this all means is there are some rather vibrant looking shades. The blue box there really stands out in an obvious way, so does the red paint here. And actually red shades in general tend to be the ones that really pop, as you might expect from the gamut. So my little crosshair in the center of the scope there really stands out as well. Just generally things do look vibrant. Yes, there are some losses of saturation caused by those shifts which I showed you with Lagom. They don't just exist because you're looking at Lagom, they do exist all the time. It's just that they tend to be easy to notice when there are large areas of solid shade. But even so, if I look at that red, for example, it's less saturated there than it is when it's displayed centrally. Not easy to show these shifts in the video, which is why I like to use Lagom to help highlight them. The green shades appear with a bit of extra saturation as well. They sort of, the yellowish greens really have an overly yellow quality to them, and some of the greens just look overly bright, so they don't really look as natural as they could. But if you like things to look vibrant, then this monitor certainly delivers that. It's one of the more vibrant VA models I've used overall, and that's in large part to that very generous colour gamut. I was going to talk about sky blues. I do like to talk about sky blues. This is more like sky greys in this particular scene, but there are some blues in there. They're a little bit overdone because of the gamut, but not to the extent that you'd see on a model with greater Adobe RGB coverage. Again, they would have more extension in the cyan region, so they would show those sky blues with even more pop. Oh, there's a little bit of a break in the clouds over there. Nice sky blue there. So it's a little bit overdone, but not in a sort of cartoonish way like some monitors might show. And usually at this point I would talk about sRGB emulation, and I would say that if you prefer things to look more as the developers intend, then it's very easy to get that kind of look and to tone down saturation by using sRGB emulation. the monitor does not have an sRGB emulation mode, so it doesn't have an sRGB gamut clamp at all. So that means that there's nothing on the monitor you can do. So if you were using a games console, for example, you'd be out of luck in that respect, unless you can sort of tweak your game in some way to do this. As a PC user, though, you do have some alternatives. Whilst it is best to have a fully flexible and well-tuned sRGB mode on the monitor itself, that's really the gold standard for this kind of thing, there's a GPU-level alternative, and that is explored in the colour reproduction section of the written review, just at the start of that. So there's something called No Video sRGB you can use as an NVIDIA user, and the AMD graphics driver has its own little toggle called Colour Temperature Control, which you can disable, and that will enable an sRGB gamut clamp, which will apply to all content, including games. And this will certainly cut down on the gamut. And again, if you're interested in that kind of thing, please do check out the written review. For color critical work, you do have to be aware of those shifts I've talked about in saturation. I generally recommend IPS or OLED models for their strong color consistency, whereas VA models for color critical work I wouldn't really recommend as highly. But if you do find yourself using that, or it's just hobbyist level work you want to be doing, then with this one you have to be aware of the 95% DCI-P3 coverage. That gives you good potential. sRGB coverage would be full as well, so good potential with the sRGB space. 90% Adobe RGB, I would not really recommend it so much for work within the Adobe RGB space. You're missing out too much on the greens in particular and the cyan shades. But really, to cut down properly on the gamut and properly correct things, you are going to have to calibrate the monitor, so profile it fully with a colorimeter or similar device. There is an ICC profile you can use which might give you decent gamut mapping in the written review. You can download that in the calibration section of the written review, but you're going to get best results by calibrating on your own system and with your own unit. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'm running the game under HDR, high dynamic range. This monitor will respond to HDR10 content in a very dynamic way. It has VESA DisplayHDR 1400 or 1400 certification. That is the highest level which VESA will certify for LCDs. And this allows it to pump out very high brightness. So the brightness here, it's very strong. It's not, and this isn't even the peak luminance that the monitor will output, by the way, because the sun isn't streaming in, it's just sort of passively illuminated daylight, if you like. And it can also give really nice depth to darker shades simultaneously. So it's putting that mini LED backlight solution to really good work. It's an FALD, full array local dimming solution, which I described earlier with local dimming. If you're just watching this section of the video review, then just to reiterate that it is very reactive, the solution, so it doesn't feel laggy. There isn't sort of a trail of halos around the place as you shift between darker and brighter content, that kind of thing. There are, however, some significant pixel responsiveness limitations to be aware of, which can actually become more apparent under HDR, and again they're explored in the responsiveness section. I've got the monitor hooked up to an NVIDIA RTX 3090 at the moment, and it is hooked up via HDMI 2.1. As usual, because I like to be very thorough, I did test this monitor with an AMD GPU. I tested with HDMI and DisplayPort on my AMD and NVIDIA GPUs, and this monitor has some interesting inconsistencies to be aware of depending on the port that you're using, and also some inconsistencies depending on the GPU you're using. And if you're using a games console, you're going to be basically using the HDMI AMD graphics hardware route. Now the good news is that via HDMI, this really gives the best look to the image under HDR, with the most appropriate depth, that kind of thing. But when I was using DisplayPort, for some reason things look quite washed out in general, as if there was a sort of uplift of gamma, as if you were viewing things under SDR with a gamma of, say, 1.8 instead of 2.2. So it really gives quite a foggy, flooded look. That doesn't occur using HDMI. Another little bit of an intricacy to be aware of on the AMD side. So HDMI, by the way, fine, AMD and NVIDIA side, and would be on games consoles as well. DisplayPort, a bit funky. The other thing is the FreeSync Premium Pro setting. So I just adjusted my camera exposure so you can see the menu. In display, there's FreeSync Premium Pro. This is an adaptive sync toggle. On my NVIDIA GPU, whether you've got this enabled or disabled, it doesn't change what it's doing under HDR. That's fine. With my AMD GPU, with this enabled, it did change things. it gave a bit more of a contrasty look. I found that it actually crushed some highlights together a bit too much as well. So I didn't like this look so much. Some people might, but I prefer the look with FreeSync Premium Pro disabled and therefore Adaptive-Sync disabled. Anyway, let's put some numbers to everything. So this somewhat busy looking graph shows the monitor with various different white patch sizes or percentage of pixels. So what this means is that there's a box in the middle of the screen and it is showing 1% of the pixels of the monitor as white and it is surrounded by pure black, or it's showing 4%, 9%, 25%, 49% or 100%. Of course, with 100%, the entire screen is white. There is no black being displayed at all. And this just gives you an idea of how the local dimming solution performs in terms of its brightness. So I'm showing you the different levels, which I discussed under SDR. So remember that level 1 or lower levels, they will dark bias more. High levels will bright bias more. But as you can see, in general, they're quite close to one another. And certainly if you compare to the orange line, which shows the Dell Alienware AW3423DW using its peak HDR 1000 mode, so that's a QD OLED monitor, which I've thrown in here for comparison. You'll see that there's obvious differences there, whereas if you compare the levels, there aren't huge differences. For the 1% patch, that's really where you see some differences, and the numbers there are just shown for level 1 and level 4 with the local dimming, just to keep things a little bit neater. But you'll see for the 1% patch, the first blobs there on the graph, the higher levels do give you a bit of extra brightness. And really where you'll notice the differences between these settings more readily is for particularly small bright content. And you will get that when you're actually using the monitor and gaming or watching HDR movie content. And just to add at this point, I did look at a lot of HDR movie content or video content on Netflix. I actually really enjoyed it overall for that kind of thing. But as with games, you know, some content makes better use of HDR than others. But it's really for those very small white elements below 1% of pixels where you'll see perhaps more distinct differences with the levels. But again, I prefer level 3. That's just my preference. You'll have your own preferences. And I could arguably say that I'd prefer different levels for different content, but I don't want to overcomplicate things. And you don't want to always be changing the level depending on the content. So I just settled with level 3. You'll then see a bump up in luminance to 4% of pixels and a further bump up to 9%, reaching a peak of 1422 nits. So that is within the specification for VESA DisplayHDR 1400 or 1400. Slightly exceeds it, but not massively. So that is very bright. And you'll also notice that it drops a bit for larger white patches. And that's normal for it to not be able to sustain its full brightness when there is a lot of white or a lot of bright content on the screen. But if you compare that to the drop that you get comparing 1% to, or perhaps 4% to 9% and then down to 25% with the QD OLED monitor, you'll see that the ViewSonic here sustains really good brightness even for a lot of bright content on the screen. Another thing to be aware of for HDR10 content is the monitor can use 10-bit color processing, which enhances the nuanced shade variety. So when you look at closely matching dark shades, good examples of that here, there's this natural uplift of detail, which you don't get under SDR. If you enhance the gamma to try and lift out the detail, it doesn't give you a greater variety of shades, it just lifts things up too much so that shades are brighter than they should be. Whereas here, you get a really nice mixture of these dark shades, which just gives a nice natural look to things. But because there are 1152 dimming zones and 5 million pixels on the monitor, you don't get the kind of level of precision you'd need to, make these really dark cracks in the rock and the shadow details super deep and super dark, because it's bordering content with medium or brighter shades. So it has to make a compromise. So it doesn't give you the kind of OLED level precision. You can also see a bit of a halo around the crosshair with the very dark content around it. And I'm just going to quickly jump onto a different scene. This one will be very familiar to you if you have watched the contrast section of the video. Now, the level of precision under HDR, the tone mapping precision, is much better than under SDR, and the look is very different here. So it's basically gone for extreme darkness, so that the monitor can respond to metadata very accurately under HDR, and the tone mapping precision is enhanced in such a way that it knows that this is supposed to be deep and atmospheric, so it is. Whereas under SDR, it kind of just had a sort of flooded looking mixture of medium shades. That does mean that you don't get the same kind of detail brought out here. That would require superior dimming precision. If the monitor was trying to do that and trying to lift out the details here, then that would come at the expense of the depth and atmosphere. But here, really, really good in that respect. Really good depth and atmosphere. You can still see a bit of a glow there, so the dimming zones there have brightened up more. That's towards the left side of the screen. And certainly in the middle, there is a bit more brightness. And particularly if I draw my bow, there's a lot of brightness there. And you can also see a halo fairly clearly in this particular example. It's a bit of a stress test for this kind of thing, actually, this scene. You can see it quite clearly around my HUD elements there. I don't know how this will come across on the video, but to my eye, even if I'm sitting in a better lit room than I am at the moment, I can see the halo there. And you will come across these halos from time to time. As I mentioned, you can lower the local dimming setting, which will mean they're less likely to form for smaller bright elements, but for big bright elements or relatively large bright elements surrounded by darkness, you're still going to get this issue. And it doesn't have to be darkness, it could be medium shades as well, as I showed you with the local dimming solution under SDR. So it isn't perfect when you have a far greater number of pixels than you do dimming zones, but there is still a good number of dimming zones, and the fact that this is a VA panel with natively strong contrast, it does help minimize those halos. And really the overall look to scenes like this is very good. To really just emphasize again, the brightness there, really impressive. You'll just be able to see this kind of big bright ball of light on the video. To the eye, it doesn't appear overexposed in the same way, but it definitely appears nice and bright. Back to the other scene quickly, and I will jump between different scenes and even different games in this section. It can be a little bit disorienting, I know, but it does help me give different examples, different subjective impressions. The glint of light on the water surface there, very bright, very eye-catching indeed. The light streaming up there, really nice look to that as well. The 10-bit precision gives a really nice nuanced shade variety here, which gives you gentler gradients. Just going to temporarily adjust the camera so you can sort of see that it's not just a giant ball of light. Of course, you won't be able to see what you see to the eye, but to the eye you do see nice gentle progressions of these bright shades. It can give weather effects and that kind of thing a more natural look. And that does depend on the game as well, and the particular content, because the game developers do have to implement it in an appropriate way. But in most modern game titles, I do find that there are certainly some elements which really do show this off nicely, and this would be an example. The monitor can be displaying really nice brightness there, whereas there, much better depth, nice depth to the medium shades there, also toned down nicely, the darker shades, much, much better than when you're using local dimming or high brightness under SDR, where the medium shades are just lifted up far too much. So the precision here is much better under HDR. It's good to see. Yes, if it had per pixel illumination or a much greater number of dimming zones, you'd be able to have the little shadow details in the vegetation even deeper, but I think it does pretty well, to be honest. The overall representation here is nice. Just whilst I load up Battlefield 5, and again it's running under HDR, yep, you'll be able to see a little bit of haloing there around the bright text with the pure black in the background, unsurprisingly. But this scene is one that I have used on a few different monitors, and I've used this game more generally on quite a few monitors when I test HDR. It has a really nice HDR implementation. I know it's not the newest game, but it is new enough that the HDR implementation is really good, and they certainly took some care over it. So I like to use it, and the monitor just really does very nicely for this scene. I've also just remembered that the monitor does have a few different HDR settings. I would just recommend sticking to the display HDR setting. There's also something called cinematic HDR and something called gameplay HDR. As I mentioned in the written review, they had no effect, at least on my NVIDIA GPU. They were exactly the same, so I wouldn't really bother using them. You do get a little bit more flexibility if you use the gameplay or cinematic HDR settings and you happen to have local dimming disabled. But if you have local dimming disabled, then the monitor basically is at 500 nits all the time, and you're not using the local dimming, which is an incredible waste of this monitor, so I have no idea why you'd want to do that. But I would just recommend using display HDR or one of the other settings, assuming they are the same on your unit as each other. Otherwise, the display HDR setting. and just leave everything default. You can't really change many things. I'll just quickly show you that. So the HDR settings, lots grayed out. Can't use pure XP, that's a strobe backlight setting. Of course, you can't ever use that kind of thing with HDR, doesn't make sense. You can adjust the response time OD, so that's the response time setting, but you can't adjust the blue light filter, color temperature settings, color adjust, so that means you can't adjust gamma or the color channels, and you can't adjust contrast, brightness, sharpness, or advanced DCR, which is this silly dynamic contrast setting. Again, don't bother using it. You've got a proper mini LED backlight here. So anyway, back to this scene. The sun there is beautifully bright, really, really nice brightness there. And the clouds as well have this nice sort of natural glow to them, and the sky in general has a certain luminosity. Lovely word. And it's all maintained regardless of how much of the scene you're looking at the same time. If you recall the graph I showed you earlier, that's because the monitor is able to sustain really good brightness even when there are a lot of bright shades are being displayed on the screen at once. So that's very different to the OLED monitors I've tested, whereby scenes like this will cause the ABL, automatic brightness limiter, to kick in rather heavily. It's a power control issue really, and that just means that this scene doesn't have these kind of bright highlights. It doesn't have the natural look to the daylight that you get here. So certainly for this kind of scene, bright daylight scene, or where there are just lots of bright elements, I really like how this monitor represents things. And because of the local dimming, it's not just flooding everything. There are a lot of different brightness levels throughout this scene, and includes some rather dark looking rocks here. And yes, again, I was going to say per pixel illumination could enhance the precision. I think you get it by this point, but what would give you that? Well, an OLED would, but then it would also be dimming more for the very bright shades. So when people just say OLEDs are fantastic for HDR and leave it there, I don't really think that's a fair representation of things, because they do have some relative weaknesses, at least current OLED monitors and QD OLED monitors, compared to this particular experience. And whilst this isn't quite as bright as the Asus PG32UQX, which was super impressive on this scene, even if you were sitting in quite a bright room, it is still impressive. And it does come much closer to that than any OLED monitor I've tested again, so I do like its representation in this scene. And even if I am sitting in a brighter room, because I don't always use HDR in a dark room, and actually I find it more comfortable to sit in a brighter room and use HDR, even for scenes like this, it's still enjoyable in a brighter room. I'm on a different scene, on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again using HDR, and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction, because that's another important aspect of HDR, sometimes overlooked by people, but it is something which I'm quite particular about, and it certainly has a vibrant look. Under HDR, the developers can target wider colour gamuts, so DCI-P3 and indeed Rec 2020, which is a much wider gamut, which this monitor does not fully cover or come close to fully covering, but at least having good DCI-P3 coverage is a good sort of start for HDR, and this one does tick that box. Yes, there are some losses of saturation, again, just like under SDR, towards the bottom of the screen and edges because of the gamma shifts and the slight inconsistencies with the colours there, but even with that in mind, overall look definitely on the vibrant side. ViewSonic has actually mapped things in a way where there is still some oversaturation, but there's less oversaturation than under SDR, where the sRGB gamut is the target, because now they're targeting the wider gamuts. That does mean that things are toned down, but ViewSonic's mapping kind of works against that a bit. So there are some kind of overly bright and overly yellowish greens, and some of the greens don't look as deep and lush as they could, and that's not just because of the way that ViewSonic's mapped things, it's also because of the fact that the colour gamut doesn't extend as much in the green region as it could. Fine for DCI-P3, but if you compare to Rec 2020, then there is quite a bit of coverage missing in the green region, but that doesn't mean that things look washed out, please don't get me wrong, it definitely isn't the case here. And if you think about the red region of the gamut here, a lot of extension there. In fact, I'll just flash the gamut up again briefly, just so if you're just watching this section of the video, you have a bit of a reference. So that certainly gives a lot of pop to red shades, but it is toned down compared to SDR. So the fires here are a good example of that. There's a nice combination of really nice vibrant looking oranges, reds and yellows. Under SDR, the oranges are brought out more strongly than this and they verge on red. Here there is a bit of extra sort of reddening to the orange a little bit, but not as much as under SDR. And I'm sorry that on the video this just looks like a giant ball of white. It's because it's also very bright as well as being highly saturated. That's just the camera. And just the red shades in general, a little bit overdone. Lara's skin as well, overdone again, but not as much as under SDR, where she can look sunburnt or suntanned, and skin tones in general just tend to look richer than they should. There's not as much of that going on, just a little bit of extra richness. So I don't really have too much more to say about HDR on this monitor. I think I really did enjoy the mini LED backlight solution. I think it's well implemented. In terms of the contrast, really nice. Yes, sure, per pixel illumination would have been nice, but you can't have everything at the moment. On the colour side, certainly vibrant. Some inconsistencies due to the panel type and also the way that ViewSonic has mapped things. Personally would have preferred things to be a little bit toned down, a bit more natural, but I think most people are going to be pretty happy with the colour output under HDR on this monitor, even if they find SDR a little bit overbearing in that respect. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This is advertised as a 200Hz monitor, but that isn't its native refresh rate. It's natively 165Hz monitor. And then there's this little overclock feature in the OSD, which will bring it up to 200Hz or unlock 200Hz refresh rate option. However, that isn't guaranteed to work at all on your system or with your unit. It's usually the unit that's the issue, that is to say the monitor itself. So with my system, RTX 3090, I've connected it with DisplayPort 1.4. I've also connected it with HDMI 2.1, and it doesn't support 200Hz at all without frame skipping, either way. And this is significant frame skipping. I can see that with frame skipping tests, but I can see that when I'm just moving the mouse on the desktop. If I'm playing a game, it's extremely obvious. It just stutters, even at a very solid 200 frames a second, or what should be 200 frames a second from the system output. So in my case, this isn't working at all. And I've spoken to a few others, a user and a reviewer, and they have had similar issues with the monitor not actually running at 200Hz without frame skipping. If you do happen to get it to work without frame skipping and you want to use it, you will lose access to Pure XP, which is the strobe backlight feature. You lose access to local dimming, and you lose any VRR, variable refresh rate support as well. If you're still thinking that sounds okay, because as a competitive gamer where 200Hz could be useful, you might not care about those features. However, what you will care about is the pixel responsiveness of the monitor, and as I'm going to explore, there are some significant weaknesses in this respect, and they occur at, well, 165Hz, they're definitely there. They're actually observable at much lower refresh rates than that, but at 200Hz, the pixel response requirements for good performance are actually massively increased. This simply can't keep up. So I've got the monitor running at 165Hz, my game's running at a solid 165 frames a second. You can see that in the top right, hopefully a little green number, but it's running solidly at 165 frames a second at the moment, making the most out of the 165Hz refresh rate. This does bring you some advantages. It gives you an increase in connected feel, so that describes how the monitor feels when you interact with it. The precision, the fluidity. It's also important that the monitor has low input lag with that in mind, and this one does. I measured around 3.5 milliseconds in this case. But it's of course not just about how things feel, it's also about how things look. And the 165Hz refresh rate is helpful in that respect. It decreases perceived blur due to eye movement. If you're not familiar with perceived blur as a concept, please do refer to the written review, the responsiveness section, where that's explored a little bit. There's also an article on responsiveness linked to there which explores this in more detail. But most of it comes from the movement of your eyes as you track motion on the screen, and as you increase the refresh rate, and your frame rate also increases, you get a decreased perceived blur due to eye movement. But in terms of the visual responsiveness, it's also very important to consider the pixel responsiveness. So I'm going to jump straight into some pursuit photographs at 165Hz. Again, if you're not familiar with what pursuit photographs are, please refer to the written review and that article I mentioned where this is all explored. So you'll see here the monitor is tested with various response time OD settings. That's what they call the overdrive on this monitor. Standard, fast, faster, ultra fast and fastest. Confusingly enough, ultra fast and fastest seem to be the wrong way around. Fastest is the final option, the final overdrive option, and it's also the final option I show from this monitor because that's ordered correctly. However, ultra fast is somehow faster than fastest in terms of the response time and the level of acceleration. Makes no sense whatsoever, but that's how they've done it. Anyway, they might as well have given these numbers less confusing, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, and also swapped around ultra fast and fastest. But you can see significant weaknesses. There is a lot of smeary trailing, particularly for the dark background, which is the top row, but quite a bit for the middle row as well. The best performance, the best balance when you observe a broader range of transitions in this comes from the faster setting. If you go up to ultra fast, there's a lot of overshoot even for the transition shown here. With fastest, it appears okay with a bit of overshoot, but does cut down on the smeary trailing a bit. Doesn't completely eliminate it, at least on these transitions. But when you're actually playing a game or just observing a broader range of transitions, you'll find that there's some extremely obvious overshoot, even using this fastest setting, which remember is actually the second fastest setting. Really weird, I know. So you're not really going to want to use that, and I will try and show you some examples in-game of this, just so you can see what I'm talking about. Really obvious bright halo trailing, rather colourful as well. So you're going to really want to use the faster setting. And if you compare this to the reference screens, we've got the CQ32G3SU and the Gigabyte M27Q. So that's an AOC model, the CQ32G3SU. The AOC model is basically an average or slightly above average VA performer, and that actually comfortably outperforms this ViewSonic. The M27Q is certainly not the fastest IPS model out there, but it's at a level which many people are very comfortable with. That very comfortably outperforms the ViewSonic in terms of pixel responsiveness. So yes, there are definite weaknesses. It doesn't affect all transitions in the same way. So this is mainly medium to brighter shades with some darker shades mixed in this kind of scene. And it's not too bad in terms of its pixel responsiveness. There is a sort of mask of extra perceived blur using my preferred faster setting, but it's not extreme. It's not sort of smeary trailing all over the place for this kind of scene. I can certainly see some more extended trailing, which I describe as smeary for some of the dark red materials with the wall in the background there. Also up here, where you've got this sort of shadowy area of wall with the sky in the background, some smearing there as well. I'm actually just going to quickly show you the fastest setting, which remember is actually the second fastest, just to see if I can show you some overshoot even in this scene here. And I certainly can. It's very obvious to my eye. Basically all around the edge of the wall here with the sky in the background, there's this bright cyan fringe, which is very eye-catching, very bright, really obvious halo trailing. You get it around the trees as well. So you might not have seen this with Test UFO, the pursuit photographs didn't really come out for those transitions so much, but when you're just playing the game, and I can see this sort of dirty trailing around the clouds there as well, which is darker than the background, so stands out in a weird way because of that. There's just loads of overshoot. So really, most people are not going to want to use this setting at all. Back to using my preferred faster setting, and I'm showing you a different scene. This has a lot of these high contrast transitions which the monitor struggles with, lots of dark shades in the mix now, against medium to dark backgrounds or somewhat brighter backgrounds, and there is obvious smeary trailing around the flag there, around the boats down there, and you don't have to circle the mouse like this to see it, by the way. I'm just doing that to try and highlight it more in the video. You can see it with just more linear motion as well. And just when you're playing the game in general, this greatly increases your perceived blur if there are dark shades involved. You can see it around the flag there as well, and the tree, around the makeshift roof here, all the usual places, and actually a particularly extreme example, I'm not sure how it'll appear on the video, you'll be able to see this sort of watery effect around the dark areas of the building there, the little pegs on it at the top there, and the window further down as well. Quite messy. I like to liken it to wetting a page with water-soluble ink on it, and it kind of runs, the ink runs onto the page. Some of the colours separate out, so you can get different shades in the mix as well. Cyan, red, magenta, whatever it might be, contained within those dark shades can leach out. I think you get the idea. It has some clear weaknesses. Another way these weaknesses can manifest is with a sort of blending together during movement. So somewhat brighter shades can darken a lot during movement, like you can see with that bush here. And actually, even the rocks with the shadow detail around the bush, you can see this a bit. You can see during movement things blend together. When the movement ceases, it brightens up, as shown as it should be. So with little movements, this can appear as a sort of flickering effect. I'm just on the desktop. I just like to show you that these issues can occur when you're on the desktop as well. It's not just when you're gaming. So here you've got mainly dark content against a bright white background. Aren't really any particular issues of note here. Well, I mean, there are, but they're sort of isolated. So for example, within the image itself, mixed contrast transitions, much as I was showing you with the game before. So when you scroll, you can see some of this smeary trailing in places, but the text is not too bad. There's not like a heavy smear around the text. So this particular transition, black with white background or light grey background, is performed okay here. Switching over to the dim setting, there are some more distinct weaknesses now. Some smeary trailing. I'm not sure how this will come across on the video. It'll be quite obvious if I move the window in this fashion. The more distinct issues, at least with Twitter, this is just an example. You'll have plenty of other web pages and other applications where you'll notice various different issues, or might notice various different issues. The lights out mode. So now you'll see this flickering I was talking about with the bush. It occurs with the grey text as well, and the grey icons with the black background. So some distinct weaknesses here. So it doesn't really manifest as smeary trailing here, depends on the movement type, but it's really just that flickering where things disappear then reappear. It also depends on your scrolling behaviour though. So I was showing you Firefox just then. I've now switched over to Google Chrome, and that seems to by default scroll a larger section of the screen at once. So you don't really get distinct smeary trailing, and you don't notice that sort of flickering here because of the scrolling behaviour. And it may depend on how you set things up in Windows as well. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. But I would say that just generally scrolling even the more troublesome content here is not particularly problematic. But you do have to remember that if you've got high frame rate animations, or depending on the web page, there may still be some issues. And certainly when you're moving windows about, or if you're doing that kind of thing on the desktop, then some more distinct weaknesses can be apparent. And I'm now on Gigabyte's website. This is a nice example of some clear pixel response time weaknesses, some real torture transitions which this monitor does not like performing. And this is on Google Chrome as well, by the way. It seems to be different scrolling behaviour here just because of this website, and I don't really know exactly what determines it, to be honest. It's not really my area, but I'm just showing you what I'm observing here. Yes, definite weaknesses when you scroll and when you move around here. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, bet you weren't expecting that, and I'm running the monitor under HDR. The reason for that is that things appear a bit different under SDR and HDR, and well, things appear very different, but in terms of how the weaknesses in pixel responsiveness can manifest, there are some differences to be aware of. So I didn't really talk about overshoot under SDR. That's because it's not really an issue that catches the eye using my preferred faster setting under SDR. I mean, there's some isolated halo trailing, that means it's a bit brighter than the background, but there aren't really any issues that jump out at me, and that's why I didn't show you them. They wouldn't have been very obvious in the video anyway, so not super bright overshoot or anything like that. And really the weaknesses there in terms of overshoot are far less apparent than the weaknesses when it comes to the smeary trailing, the weaknesses in pixel responsiveness, the slow pixel responses. You definitely get a lot of that under HDR. It doesn't suddenly become a non-issue. In fact, under HDR, you have to remember that you're going to have a lot of high contrast transitions, a lot of these very dark shades with brighter shades mixed in. So yes, smeary trailing is certainly an issue under HDR. This is quite a bright scene, but even then there are some mixtures of shades. You can see a lot of what I've been talking about. You probably would have picked this up in the HDR section as well, these weaknesses, although I wasn't specifically talking about them. But overshoot is also an issue in places under HDR. So remember that there's higher brightness, so this can become more apparent. The transitions being performed have changed, so the darker shades are actually quite a bit darker. Also under HDR, the monitor has to push the pixel transitions a bit faster, particularly in this case because it's using local dimming. And if you activate local dimming on its own, some of this can become apparent as well, these weaknesses. But really under HDR, it's sort of another level of apparent overshoot. Hopefully you can see this on the video. Sort of flashes of color here, kind of a green or cyan trail around here. Also, you can see some magenta as well when I zoom in, actually. Very pretty, but not really what you want to see. I've just switched over to the fast setting. This does tone the overshoot down a bit. Still there, but it's not as obvious. And just in general, I prefer using fast for HDR and faster for SDR because of the overshoot. It does mean that you get a bit more smeary trailing, but to be honest, it's really something that you can notice with either setting. And just the overshoot on top using the faster setting is a bit too much in my opinion, but please do experiment yourself and see which you prefer. But it is a little bit annoying that you can't just have one set and forget setting for HDR and SDR in this case. I'm back on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about VRR, variable refresh rate. This monitor supports VRR via Adaptive-Sync, so you can use that with AMD FreeSync for example, and also NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. And that's supported via HDMI and DisplayPort. Some quirks to be aware of. If you are using Adaptive-Sync or want to use Adaptive-Sync, you have to actually have what's called AMD FreeSync Pro enabled in the OSD, and for some reason that locks the brightness at a very high level, actually higher than the default under SDR, so it's around 500 nits it'll lock it at. It could vary a bit between units. I've seen some people actually record a little bit higher, some reviewers, with the FreeSync Premium Pro setting active in the OSD. So you need to have that active even if you're not specifically using FreeSync. You want to use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via DisplayPort, then you do need to have that setting active so you have locked high brightness. Really odd, really annoying. You can use HDMI 2.1 VRR as well, and that gives you access to NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, and you don't need that FreeSync Premium Pro setting active, which means you'll be able to adjust the brightness. Either way though, you get a very similar experience outside of that, and that includes a claimed 48 to 165 Hz VRR range, variable refresh rate range, but I actually found it generally was more like 55 to 165 Hz, and below that 55 Hz it switched to LFC, low frame rate compensation, or a similar frame to refresh multiplication technology, and that keeps tearing and stuttering at bay by ensuring that the refresh rate sticks to a multiple of the frame rate. So if, for example, the game was running at 40 frames a second, the monitor could be running at 80 Hz. And that's really what VRR is designed to do, get rid of tearing and stuttering, and it did that. It did that in much the same way with my AMD and NVIDIA GPU. But now for some bad news. I'm running a VRR flickering test, and what this does, I will link to it in the description of the video, is it causes a cycling of various refresh rates quite rapidly, so it simulates significant fluctuations in frame rate. And with this model, there's definite VRR flickering. This is causing, as I said, significant fluctuations, but you don't actually need these significant fluctuations to have issues with VRR flickering on this model. It's just very easy to show you with this test because it does that kind of thing. Not sure how this will appear on the video, but that kind of pulsing you can see for the, well, any shade really, sort of darker shades, it looks like a pulsing. You can see a bit of a flickering for the brighter shades as well to the eye. It is problematic. That is from the monitor. And VRR flickering is something which some models are prone to, VA monitors are particularly prone to it. I'm not going to go through the technical details. You can read the FreeSync experience section of the written review if you want to know a bit more about this. But definite issues here. If you're in the triple digits, even if your frame rate's rather stable, you still get this flickering from time to time. I wouldn't say it's extreme flickering in the triple digits, although I can still see it in the sky there in the background, even though my frame rate's quite stable, although technically it's double digits now because I've changed the graphics settings. But even when it's in the triple digits, I could see this flickering from time to time. But when you're in double digits, as I am now, it actually becomes more significant. It looks like almost like there's lightning in the sky sometimes, but that's not actually supposed to be there. So again, I'm not sure how this will appear on the video, but to the eye it is quite distracting. I'm not super sensitive to flickering either, but in this case it was just too much, and there are those significant fluctuations, which doesn't happen so much with my RTX 3090, but can happen depending on the content and depending on your GPU and what's happening. Then really the flickering becomes rather intense. I didn't like to use VRR for this reason. For me, that's quite rare. Usually I'd keep VRR on even if there's a bit of VRR flickering, as you get with some OLED screens, for example. But in this case, just too much VRR flickering for me. But if you can stomach it and you're using VRR, I might as well continue to talk a little bit about the experience here. The good news is that there isn't extreme overshoot. I'm still using my faster setting, and the overshoot levels do increase a little bit, but it's again really the smeary trailing and the weaknesses associated with that which are the most eye-catching things you'll notice, or the most eye-catching weaknesses you'll notice. I've now locked the game at 60 frames a second, and even here I wouldn't say there is suddenly extreme overshoot. And I have observed this more broadly, not just on this scene, so I have looked at a wider range of transitions. And yes, there is a bit of an increase in overshoot, but nothing dramatic. And again, it's really the sort of weaknesses. Even at 60 frames a second, they are still rather apparent. They are less apparent. The pixel response requirements are massively decreased for a decent performance here. They're less apparent, but they're still there. Still some definite smeary trailing in places. It might be that this monitor does use some degree of variable overdrive, but I think it's more that the acceleration levels are really low enough, even using the faster setting, under SDR at least, that it doesn't cause issues even at these lower refresh rates, where that level of acceleration could potentially increase the overshoot significantly. But I do want to give the monitor a bit of credit, because it might use some variable overdrive where things are retuned, and that is nice to see. It's just a shame about that VRR flickering, which for me again was just too much for me to enjoy VRR. And be aware that as your frame rate drops, you do notice a decrease in connected feel, and you notice an increase in perceived blur due to eye movement. And also, if you're frequently passing that LFC boundary, then there is a momentary stuttering which occurs, and that's not specific to this monitor. It's something which I always observe with Adaptive-Sync. Just to reiterate as well that my experience with Adaptive-Sync on my AMD GPU using AMD FreeSync was very similar, or FreeSync Premium Pro, very similar. Still had the VRR flickering in the same kind of places, the same kind of intensity, same VRR range, same kind of behavior. Another thing is this monitor does have a setting called Pure XP, which you can use if you're not using VRR. It's a strobe backlight setting. As I explore in some detail in the written review, it isn't very good. There's a lot of strobe crosstalk, significant weaknesses with pixel responsiveness which cause issues. Also overshoot in the mix there is more obvious, and it locks the overdrive settings. You can't do anything about that. Not that you necessarily want to, because then you're just going to get more smeary trailing. It's really smeary fragmented trailing when you've got a strobe backlight setting active. So I don't see very much utility in this strobe backlight setting, to be honest. To wrap up then, the monitor has good ergonomics and a solid feel to it, solid premium feel, but that's partly due to the very large stand, which really takes up far too much desk depth. It's really much larger than it has to be, so it's quite a hog in that respect. You can use alternative mounting if you prefer, but if you really do like those heavy, solid, chunky stands with lots of metal, then you might well like this one. The contrast performance was strong, as I'd hoped from a VA panel, actually stronger than some VA models, around 4000:1 static contrast, so that's good. Moderate amount of VA glow, black crush, a little bit of that, not an extreme amount. A potential trick up the sleeve is the local dimming setting, which you can use even under SDR, and that will greatly enhance your contrast by using 1152 zone local dimming. And that certainly did have a positive effect in that respect. However, I didn't like that they locked the brightness at a very high level. It basically meant that using the setting was just like a clearly inferior version of HDR, rather than it being something you might want to use to greatly enhance the contrast but keep things at a sort of comfortable brightness for you that you'd use for prolonged normal SDR viewing anyway. In terms of the colour performance, the monitor offers vibrant output, particularly strong reds because of the colour gamut, lots of extension beyond sRGB, particularly in the red region, strong pinks as well, so it's really the red to blue edge. There are some saturation losses, as usual for VA panels, towards the edges of the screen, generally the bottom and the side edges from a normal viewing position. These weren't extreme shifts, but were certainly there. And the monitor doesn't offer an sRGB emulation mode, so if you don't like this vibrant output, then there isn't a little mode you can just select to clamp the gamut neatly. It would be nice to see that, and it would have been particularly nice to have one of those which is well tuned and ideally flexible as well. There are GPU driver alternatives you can use as a PC user with an AMD or NVIDIA GPU, but they're not perfect, and obviously if you're using the monitor with a games console, then that's not really going to be something that you can make use of. The HDR performance of the monitor is just strictly thinking of this in a sort of static level and not thinking about the fact that things are going to be moving, and that will bring me on to responsiveness, which I'm going to talk about very shortly. The HDR performance as a whole was actually very strong on this monitor. It was able to produce nice deep atmospheric dark shades, very brilliant bright light shades. Even if you aren't sitting in a particularly dark room, I found that I was able to enjoy the bright scene HDR performance, the dark scene HDR performance. It isn't as good as OLED in terms of its precision, 1152 dimming zones versus millions of pixels, but I certainly got some enjoyment using HDR on this monitor for gaming and also HDR video content, and I was impressed by its bright scene ability. Compared to OLED monitors, for example, it was able to sustain really high brightness levels regardless of how much brightness was being displayed in the scene. Now, that brings me on to responsiveness. So with the HDR experience, I said it was sort of nice at a static level. What I meant by that is not including the fact there are some distinct weaknesses when it comes to pixel responsiveness. So yes, the monitor does support 165 Hz, forget 200 Hz, it's just not happening on this monitor, and if it is happening because you've got a unicorn that happens to run at 200 Hz without frame skipping, well, the pixel responses aren't going to keep up or give you a good experience there anyway. It also had low input lag, so that was helpful. And VRR did work, but there were issues with flickering, and if you're using Adaptive-Sync, you have to activate FreeSync Premium Pro as a setting on the monitor, and that locked brightness, which was very odd. It locked it to a high level. Another quirk was, for some reason, the HDR mapping was incorrect with DisplayPort, and it looked quite washed out, whereas with HDMI it looked much nicer, much richer, much more as I'd expect it to look. Bit of an odd quirk, and also HDR has changed again if you've got FreeSync Premium Pro active in the OSD and you're using an AMD GPU. If you're using an NVIDIA GPU, that doesn't have an effect. And remember that games consoles also use AMD hardware. And because it has HDMI 2.1, you can use HDMI 2.1 VRR with NVIDIA GPUs and with compatible games consoles as well. And the monitor does include a 3840 by 2160 downsampling mode, which will work at up to 120 Hz. So it does have good compatibility for games consoles, as good as I've seen actually from an ultrawide, because it is ultrawide. And it is worth noting that really a big part of the experience here is to use the entire desktop real estate, the entire width of the screen, the entire screen space. And I did find that immersive. I didn't find the curve problematic or anything like that. It was something which I found very natural to use on a screen of this width. So I did like that kind of experience, but as a games console user, you're going to be having a 16:9 experience on this monitor. You can't use the full ultra-wide resolution or capabilities. So with all this said, I do have to bear in mind that this is not a cheap monitor. It retails for around $1,500 US, or $1,500 if you prefer to say it in that way. So it's not a cheap monitor. It also has definite flaws, particularly when you look at the pixel responsiveness, definite weaknesses which could sour the experience for some people. It certainly did for me. And I have to compare it to the 34-inch QD OLED monitors, so the Dell Alienware AW3423DW. That's a monitor I'm intimately familiar with because I actually use that as my daily driver, if you like, at the moment. So I've got a lot of experience with that. And really, I did draw the comparison a lot when I was reviewing this, and the QD OLED monitor is just so much stronger in many areas. The color consistency is much better. I prefer the screen surface. It's not perfect, but that's matte versus glossy debate. Leave that for another time. Also, the far superior contrast when you look at the per pixel illumination, certainly in a darker room or a more dimly lit room, that is a clear edge in my opinion. And it comes into its own when it comes to HDR and its ability to offer extreme precision for the luminance control. And really the responsiveness is absolutely night and day when it comes to the pixel responsiveness comparing the QD OLED monitors to this one. But it's not all bad news for the ViewSonic. Again, the HDR performance, it is stronger than those QD OLEDs when it comes to its bright scene HDR performance. It's able to sustain its brightness better for scenes which are dominated by bright shades. So it was good in that respect, I have to say. And also, I know there are some quirks with the QD OLED monitors which some people may not like. Yes, of course, there's a screen surface intricacies there, which I'm not going to get into here, but you can check my review of that monitor for more information about that. Same with the subpixels. So this monitor, the ViewSonic, has normal RGB subpixels, no quirks to be aware of that could affect text clarity significantly or anything like that, just due to the subpixel arrangement. Whereas with the QD OLEDs, they've got this strange arrangement there. Again, you can look at that in the review of that model. That could be an issue for some people. And of course, I know there are burn-in concerns. I haven't had any issues with my own Alienware in that respect, and I actually spend a lot of time on the desktop. I'm actually spending most of my time on the desktop these days, but a fair amount of time gaming and enjoying content consumption as well. So yes, it's difficult to outright recommend this monitor, to be honest, but it does have some strengths which, depending on what you're after from the experience, could be worth considering. But for most people, I would seriously look at the QD OLED alternatives. So that's really all there is to the ViewSonic XG341C-2K. Be sure to check out the full written review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, that's a nice way of showing your support.